turning to Hebrews 11. Hebrews chapter 11 is going to be the basis of our study here. Tonight. Before we get into chapter 11, though, we do want to give ourselves a quick reminder of what we've seen so far in the book, and then we'll get into chapter 11. The book of Hebrews is about the fact that Christ is better. The key verse is chapter 1 and in verse 4, in which it talks about the fact that Christ has become so much better than the angels. And so that's the key verse to that chapter. That's the key verse to the entire book. It's really laying that groundwork of the idea that Christ is better. As you go throughout the book, particularly the first half, that's what the book's focused on, is the superiority of Christ. Christ is superior in chapter 1 through chapter 10 and in verse 18. He's superior to prophets, chapter 1, 1 to 3. Superior to angels, 1, 4 through 2, 18. He's superior to Moses, chapter 3, 1 to 19. He offers superior rest, chapter 4, 1 through 13. He has a superior priesthood, chapter 4, 14 through chapter 7 and in verse 28, at the end of the chapter. He has a superior covenant, or brings a superior covenant in chapter 8. Chapter 9, the first part of that, is about the superior sanctuary. And then chapter 9, the rest of it, verse 15 through chapter 10, is about his superior sacrifice. Well, after talking about the fact that Christ is better, or Christ is superior, the Hebrew writer then comes in 10:19 through the end of the book and reminds them, don't give up, there is no other way. Really, the first half of the book has been focused on the fact that what you're on is the right way. As there are some here thinking about giving up, the Hebrew writer is reminding them, you're on the right path, keep on that path. And so then 10:19 through 13:28 is a reminder, not only are you on the right path, but if you leave that path, there's no other way. So don't give up. And so we saw in chapter 10 last Wednesday, the end of 10, and again on Sunday, about keeping the faith. And so he reminds them there at the end of chapter 10 of their need to hold fast. He reminds them there at the end of chapter 10 about their need to draw near with a true heart. He reminds them about not sinning willfully. He reminds them about the fact that they've overcome tribulations before. He reminds them that if you overcome those tribulations and trials, you can have the reward. Don't give up. Keep the faith. Chapter 11, then, is look to examples of faith. And so we're very familiar with chapter 11, where we are this evening. And as we look at these examples here, what the Hebrew writer is reminding them of is you need to look to examples of faith. And really, as he comes to the end of the chapter and reminds them, don't just look to examples of faith. Remember this, the examples that you look to were faithful to God, and we have something better than what they had. Chapter 12, endure in faith. It talks about being surrounded by the great cloud of witnesses, run with endurance the race that is set before us. Talks about enduring chastening from the Lord. And then chapter 13 is making application of faith. 13 is really here's what you need to do and how you need to live and make application of faith. Our chapter content now. Chapter 1, Christ is superior to prophets and angels. Chapter 2, he's superior to angels continued, and that he's a divine human. Chapter 3, he's superior to Moses, and do not be disobedient. Chapter 4, he offers a superior rest. Chapter 5, he is a superior high priest. Chapter 6, that parenthetical there, dealing with their immaturity, is the exhortation to go on to perfection. Chapter 7, Christ's superior priesthood. Chapter 8, a superior ministry and covenant. Chapter 9, the old covenant was a type of the new. And then chapter 10, the superior sacrifice. That's the first half. And the exhortation of faithfulness. That's the second half there at 19 through the end of the chapter. We're in Hebrews chapter 11. We've titled this chapter The Hall of Faith. Now, we made this point on Sunday morning. If you're a sports fan and you watch sports, the greatest honor that an individual athlete could receive, or an individual coach or anything could receive in that sport, is being inducted into that sports Hall of Fame. When we look at Hebrews chapter 11, if there was a physical Hall of Fame, that is, if like you can go a few hours away to Canton, Ohio, and go through the NFL's Hall of Fame, and you can see the statues of all these great players who were inducted into the Hall of Fame there, and coaches and all that. If we had a place like that for people of the Old Testament, where we knew what they looked like, and we had statues set up as we went through, and you could say, you see, these are great examples of faith. That's what this chapter really is. It's Faith's Hall of Fame. Here are people that you can look to as some of the best examples of faith, particularly as we're talking about and focus on Old Testament examples. These are the best examples of faith you can look to and what they did. The key verse to the chapter is verse number 6. But without faith, it is impossible to please Him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He's a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. Just a reminder to set up the chapter 11 as we begin. Chapter 10 ended with this statement. But we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul. He reminds them there that the Hebrew writer, those with the Hebrew writer, and what those there that he's writing to need to be is not those who draw back to perdition or destruction, but those who believe to the saving of the soul. Now, what he's going to point out in chapter 11 is, here are some people that believed in God. They had faith in God. And again, when he comes to the end of the chapter, the point is, here are people that believed in God. Here's people that had faith in God, and guess what? We have something better than they had. And they had faith and endured and obeyed. And so we can have faith that endures and obeys. We touched on the first 3 verses on Sunday morning, so we'll hit that rather quickly here, and then we'll focus on examples of faith. 1 to 3 is a description of faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, verse 1. It is the evidence of things not seen. As we pointed out, it's the substance or the realization, as the New King James footnote says, of things that are hoped for, but that's not without evidence. So we said sometimes today we'll talk about faith, and somebody will say, well, he took a leap of faith. And what we're saying is he just sort of took a blind leap at something, right? That's how we use it, how people use it a lot of times. A leap of faith is just sort of this, well, they kind of just blindly jumped into something. That's not what faith is. It's the substance of things hoped for. It's the evidence of things not seen. Faith is based off of what? Evidence. Now, do we see God face to face? No. Can we see that God exists by the evidence around us? Absolutely. Faith is based off evidence. In fact, we'll get to verse 3 in a minute. He points that out again as you get into verse 3. But before he gets to that, he says in verse 2, for by it, that is by faith, the people, or the elders, that is the people of old, those that from the Old Testament, obtained a good testimony. Really what 4 through 38 is here's the elders of the people of old that obtained the good testimony. Why? Because of their faith. And so that's why that phrase, by faith, is going to occur time and time again. Verse 3, though, by faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made were not made of things which are visible. And that is, we know that the world was created. If we take this Lord's Supper table here, this table had to be what? Somebody made this table. It didn't just appear here one day in the middle of the building. Somebody made that. Now, whoever made that is somebody that's visible. The point he's making here is we know the worlds were framed, and it's not by someone you can see, physically see, because God's in heaven, but the point is we know that he created it. How do we know that? It's by faith. There's evidence that he created it. The creation around is evidence. We know he created that, though, by faith. Verse 4, then, we start those examples of faith. Again, focus in on verse 2 for a second. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. 4 through 38 is those who obtained a good testimony by faith. The first example is Abel, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he being dead, still speaks. Now, something that I would encourage you to do, if you've got some highlighters or not necessarily pens, depending on what type you've got, but pencils or colored pencils or something, I would encourage you that as we go through to do this, and if you don't, I would encourage you later on to go back and do this, circle the phrase in one color, by faith. I've got it both in my physical copy of my Bible here, and I've got it on my iPad here. That they're circled or highlighted or boxed in one color is the phrase, by faith. That way, when you're studying and you're looking at the text, you can see that times that occurs. I don't have verse 3 highlighted here, but I would encourage you to go ahead and get verse 3 to you while you're at it. By faith, we understand. These verses are going to have something that follows them that tells us that by faith, they did something. So remember, we're quickly closing in. We have 2 chapters left after we finish chapter 11. Our next study is the book of James. The book of James is about being a doer of the word. We're very familiar with chapter 2. Faith without works is dead. Well, as you go through Hebrews chapter 11, these obtained a good testimony by what? According to verse 2. By faith. But it wasn't just a believing in God. Look at what Abel did, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. His faith caused him to do something, right? It was an active, obedient faith. What he did was he offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous. Well, why was he righteous? Because by faith he obeyed. We're familiar with Abraham, who we'll talk about Abraham later and some of the things Abraham did. But remember, Romans would point this out, Old Testament quotation, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for what? Righteousness. Verse 4, by faith Abel offered. He had faith. He acted on that faith, through which he obtained witness that he was what? Righteous. How do we obtain witness that we're righteous? It's by having an active, obedient faith. By the way, Abel was not called righteous by man. Look again at what he says. Through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he being dead still speaks. Somebody may look at another individual and say, you know what, that's a righteous individual. Can we be mistaken? Yeah. We could look at somebody and think they're righteous, and maybe they're putting on a front. Take the Pharisees in the Scriptures as an example. Now, a lot of them some people could probably see through their hypocrisy, but here they are putting on this idea that there were these overly righteous individuals who followed, who made sure every I was dotted, who made sure every T was crossed. They were going to do everything exactly like they were supposed to do. But as Jesus said in Matthew 23, underneath, they're full of dead men's bones. They're the cup that if you get it out of the cabinet, the outside is clean, but the inside is dirty. They put on something that we can see. We can be mistaken. You know who's not mistaken about if man's righteous? God. God's not mistaken. And so, when Abel obtained witness that he was righteous, that was God saying he was righteous. The Hebrew writer here is saying he's righteous by inspiration. And the point we need to understand is when we have faith like Abel, that offers to God a sacrifice that he's deserving of. Now, we may not be offering blood sacrifices, right? We don't have to offer that as we go back. But we do need to offer the sacrifice of ourselves to be that living sacrifice. If we offer sacrifices to God and worship to God that's pleasing, we can obtain testimony not from man, but from God that we're what? We're righteous. And through it, he being dead still speaks. You think about it. Abel was, you go all the way back through history, you had Adam and Eve, and then there Cain and Abel. Abel was the first person to die. Here we stand in 2025 now, on January the 22nd of 2025, and who are we talking about? Abel. and the kind of example he set and the kind of faith he had. He died a very long time ago. Nobody died farther from now than Abel. He was the first person to die. And guess what? We're still talking about him today. He, though he's dead, still speaks. His faith and the action that he took speaks volumes of the kind of man that he was, so that we can take and we can make application of that in our lives. Yes.
It seems like sometimes certain people, members of the church, they'll go to where you alluded to their, faith without works is dead. I mean, they'll really pound the pulpit on that. And that's true. He that believeth and is baptized will be saved. We use it in that kind of realm lots of times. But Jesus talked about a lifetime of sanctification. So even after you're baptized into Christ, there's going to be decisions that we have to make. And maybe the flesh wants to do one thing. And it may be things that isn't necessarily inherently wrong, but it's going to make us put that before God. And so what my point is, this faith is something that includes, but it's not limited to our initial conversion. So as we go out through our life, whatever years we have left, if it even amounts to years after we're baptized into Christ, we need to, by faith, be obedient to all of God's commands. And sometimes we may question, well, if I don't do this, then I'm not going to have money to do this or something. But by faith, we're going to be demonstrating. And if another book is going to be written, they might say, well, by faith, Micah did such and such, was a demonstration. One other thing I was thinking about, there's a guy named Dave Joy, who's a gospel preacher, a lot of people here know him. He died in his 30s. But even after he was dead, I would still read articles he had written. Him being dead still speaks. So there's a sense by, even today, people we've known that were maybe instrumental in helping us with our faith, we can look at those people. They're not reported in this book, but they still testify to us, and we're still encouraged by what they did when they occupied the physical body.
You're right, and I think that's an important lesson for us to learn and understand is about that. I'm not going to say much more about that right this second, because the invitation is going to be the question of if we're in that hall of faith, so I'll hold that thought for a few moments, not to give away the invitation too soon. But you're right, that is something that we need to evaluate in ourselves, is if we have that active faith. We're going to get to Abraham here in a minute. And Abraham obeyed God and left Ur of the Chaldees. And then God gave him something else to do, and Abraham obeyed God. And Abraham is one of those that he has a section from verses 8 to 19. The longest section dedicated to any person is dedicated to Abraham. Now, there's a few verses in there that's really talking about the patriarchs as a whole. But and one verse talking about Sarah. But for the most part, Abraham there, because Abraham, by faith, and he did a number of things to be obedient to God. Verse 5 now. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he had taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. Now, Enoch is one of those, as we work through the statement here, it just simply says Enoch was taken and did not see death. It, unlike Abel, doesn't spell out as much detail about Enoch. But in fact, we know very little about Enoch except for this verse here. Genesis 5:24, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And so very little is said here about Enoch in terms of the number of words that are said, but a whole lot said about Enoch because there are only two people that never saw death. There are only two people who never died. We're familiar with Elijah. He's the one we best remember, and the other's Enoch. And the reason that God took him, and he was not because God had taken him, as Genesis would point out, is because he walked with God. Here's a man that didn't just believe God, he lived it in his everyday walk of life, walking with God. Verse 6 now. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So as the Hebrew writer introduced Hebrews 11, he talked about what faith was in 1, 2, and 3. He then got to examples of faith. And verse 6 almost seems like he takes a pause to leave his discussion. What are we talking about? Now all of a sudden we're talking about why faith is necessary. So the point he's making is we've just looked at two examples who had faith. A man who God testified as righteous. A man who God took because he pleased him. The reason for both of those is they had what? Faith. Because without that, it's impossible to please God. We must believe that God is. That's part of faith. But we must believe that He will reward those who diligently seek Him. You know what verse 6 has as well? An action taking place. We need faith to be pleasing to God. We don't just believe that He is, but He's a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. There's an action that has to take place there in verse 6.
I remember too, that doesn't necessarily mean reward in this physical world. We know Stephen, he was being stoned to death. He looked up and he saw the glory of God, but then he actually saw Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Okay, did he receive the reward? Yeah, he's rewarded. Some people might look at that and say, well, yeah, look, he had faith to the point that he preached till he was stoned and things like that. But he was rewarded. You know, maybe not in the sense, sometimes we equate maybe giving our life for Christ. You know, Herod had James killed with the sword, saw it pleasing the Jews. He also sought to kill Peter. And, you know, well, James, he got his reward. You know what I mean? And,
you're right.
Yeah, we don't want to equate, that reward's not always in this life, I guess is what I'm saying.
You're right. You know what?
You're right. You know, and I think as we get later on in 13 through 16, that point's going to be made about Abraham and the other patriarchs. They didn't see the promise of God fulfilled. You take those 3 promises that God made, which of those did they ever see in their lifetime? The answer is none of them, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, who would have been we think of Joseph, but if we're technically in the patriarchs, Judah's next in line because that's the line through the Christ. None of them ever saw the promise. None of the sons of Jacob ever saw those promises fulfilled. They never saw them take the land. Remember, they were in Egypt when they died. They never saw them become a great nation. That didn't happen in Exodus 20. The land far after that, none of them ever saw the days of Christ, physically seeing them. They did by faith, which is a point that's made, but they were pressing towards that reward.
Well, the reason I bring that up is because it's easy, even knowing the Scriptures, when we want things to happen a certain way. In this life, and they don't happen that way, then we might get to think, well, God's not a rewarder, you know. And you think about the Apostle Paul, well, he fought the good fight, finished, of course, kept the faith. He's going to get that crown of life. But while he navigated through this life, his thorn in the flesh wasn't removed. But like I said, there's lots of times people, maybe some of us, we may tend to give up when trials and tribulations of this life come along. We think, well, I thought he was going to reward us. So, yeah, that can strengthen us not to give up when we're in, trials and things.
You're right. And I think that's one of those things there. You talk about the reward. That you're right. We may misunderstand at times. And I said this before. I think where some of our confusion comes in is we confuse the terms joy and happiness, because it talks about a Christian always being joyful, and there's joy in trials, and we account joy as happiness. And I mentioned this before. Several years ago, I was in Oklahoma City working with a preacher there for the summer, and I remember him making that point. And I hadn't really thought about it that way before, and he made the point. And he said, "Let me illustrate it this way." He said, and I've illustrated it this way here before: if you hit your thumb working on something with a hammer, are you happy? No. It's going to be in quite a bit of pain. Does that mean you're deprived of the joy of being a Christian? No. Happiness is determined by outward circumstances. The joy can still remain within us. We may be in trials. Are we going to be, necessarily all that happy if we're getting beaten? In the sense that this feels great? No. But we can have the joy for knowing that we're suffering for serving Christ. I think that's where some of that confusion comes in, is we confuse it, is that even when pressure and trials are coming, there can be joy, even though outward circumstances may seem to be making us unhappy, and we confuse that at times. Verse 7 now. Let's look at Noah. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So again, here's our phrase, by faith. Why did Noah do what he did? By faith. What did he do? He moved with godly fear. And he prepared an ark, as it mentioned later on. But the preparing of an ark is a result of that godly fear. I think there's a question that comes up at times about the flood. And the question is, and I've heard people say that they've gone to, I think it's in Kentucky, you've got the Creation Museum, and then you've got what's supposed to be a replica of the ark with a museum in there. And this question gets gets raised. And I think they talk about it, somebody told me they talk about it at that Ark Museum, or Ark Encounter, whatever it is they call it. Had it ever rained before? That's a question that always comes up. Well, had it ever rained before? The days of Noah. And I don't know if it had ever rained before, but I know this. It had never rained like that before, and it's never rained like that ever again. That the fountains of the deep would open up. The water, by the way, wasn't just falling from the sky. The fountains of the deep were opened up. The water was coming from above and below to cause such a great flooding. And so whether it had ever rained before, and people, well, it doesn't matter, because even if it had rained or hadn't rained, it had never rained like this. And if you could imagine, Noah's being told it's going to rain so much that the tops of the mountains are going to be covered. Now, in 120 years, I'm going to send this flood, and this is what it's going to do. To the human mind, that sounded absolutely crazy. Again, if it hadn't rained, then it would be, well, what's this water falling from the sky? If it had rained, they'd be thinking, well, why is it going to fall so heavy that you think that the mountains are going to be covered? Look how high the mountains are. Yet Noah moved with godly fear. Two things about fear. We always talk about two aspects of fear. The first of those is being afraid. There's a sense in which Noah has to be afraid of not doing what God says because he believes God. And we'd all be afraid if we were told, hey, the tops of the mountains are going to be covered and everything's going to be flooded, and we believe that that's going to be true. Is there going to be a sense of some fear? Absolutely. The other side of that, though, is reverence and respect. And I think that's what causes him to move, is not just being afraid, his reverence and respect for God. That's what allows him to have that trust in God, so that when God says, I'm going to send a flood, and again, whether it had rained or not, I don't know, but again, it had never rained like this. A flood that had never been seen before, a flood like that has never been seen again. And it was worldwide. And here this flood takes place. And yet Noah had faith. He believed in God to the point that he moved with godly fear, and he prepared an ark to be prepared for when that flood came, by which he condemned the world and became the heir of righteousness according to faith. Here's an example of faith to look to. A man who moved with godly fear.
During that time, he was trying to bring one of these in either he talked about. He was preaching that time too. And you think about it, he had the godly fear. And it's just like today, you tell people this earth is going to be destroyed with fervent heat. No different today. Kind of like Noah said, this flood's coming. Through the revealed word, we know fire, destruction's coming. And you might preach 100 years, okay? But there's going to be people, you know what I mean? But by godly fear, you go ahead and work out your own salvation, fear and trembling. But you're wanting other people to get on the ark, so to speak, too. You can't force anyone on there. And people's heart, and I think about Sodom and Gomorrah, this place will be destroyed tomorrow. Lot's sons-in-law said they laughed or they mocked at him, things like that. No different today. But after that fire and brimstone started coming down, they didn't need faith anymore. It became a reality.
Here, right, here he was. Noah was preaching the whole time, motivated by that fear of God, and we've got to have that motivation right today. And as it talks about him being saved through water in 1 Peter chapter 3, talking about it being an antitype to that which now saves us, or corresponding to baptism. We've got to get people to be saved through the water today by being baptized. Not that something in the water, as Peter would point out, but that's because they can have their conscience cleansed. They can have their sins washed away. Let's talk about Abraham. That's probably not even going to get through all of Abraham. Let's go ahead and go 8 through 12. We're going to hit this down a little bit, because there's, again, that pause in 13 to 16. Beginning at verse 8. By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out of the place which he would have received as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. By faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky, in multitude, innumerable as the sand, which is by the seashore. Go back again to verse 8. Again, if you're highlighting, by faith, there's our phrase again, Abraham obeyed. Is faith obedient? Well, Abraham's faith was obedient. Here's a man who, by faith, obeyed. Here's the man, verse 9, who by faith dwelt in the land of promise. I think, again, sometimes I think we don't understand how much of a sacrifice it was for Abraham. If we think about this part alone, I think we'll all agree. I've said it before. Nobody, I don't know anybody that likes to move. And when we normally move, you know what happens? We know where we're going. It's not like, oh, we're going to get in a truck, we're going to drive around and find a place to move, and then when we get there, we'll find out where we're going whenever we get there, and that's where we're going to be. Right? That's not how we move. We're going to move into this place, you pack up and you move. That's not fun. Not knowing where you're going would be even less fun, moving. But what if you went from a place that was rather advanced for the time to dwell in a tent? Ur of the Chaldees, at the time of Abraham, was a rather advanced city in terms of some of the advancements, technological advancements they had, and the way that city functioned. It was ahead of its time. Abraham left that city. And he went on a journey, not knowing where he was going, stopped in Haran for a time, and then from there went the rest of the way after his father died to the land of Canaan, where he dwelt in a tent, and the only land he ever owned was a burial plot. You know what it's going to take if God told us to leave a place like Ur that's advanced, to go to a place we don't know, and to dwell in a tent? You know what it's going to take? It's going to take faith. And Abraham had that faith so that he dwelt in that country. Now, verse 10 gives us a little bit of insight into the mindset of Abraham, and he's going to come back to it in 13 through 16. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now, sometimes, if you're reading a commentary on the Old Testament, you might read something along these lines. The people of the Old Testament didn't understand or didn't know about life after death. You might read something about some statement like that in a commentary. You know, you go back to the Old Testament, and that in the Old Testament, it doesn't focus as much on talking about eternity, which in the Old Testament, it was a more physical law in terms of the way the law was given. Ecclesiastes will share some insight into a standing judgment, but the idea is painted sometimes that, well, they didn't really know about standing judgment and about life after death. No. Abraham waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. He, verse 13 through 16, acknowledged he was a sojourner and a pilgrim, not in Canaan, on the earth. Right? Look at verse 13 again. Right? We're skipping a little bit ahead. But they embraced them and confessed they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Now, obviously, he was a stranger and a pilgrim in Canaan, but that's not what he's talking about. He's a stranger and pilgrim on the earth. Guess what? The same terminology in 1 Peter is used to talk about us. We sing songs based off that idea. You know what that tells me? Abraham knew about life after life on this earth. He knew about something about eternity. Now, he may not know as much as we do because we have the full revelation of God, but Abraham knew something because he was focused on that city. Yes. You're right. That idea like us, that our citizenship's in heaven, that he was focused on where his citizenship was and focused on going home. Verse 11 real quick. By faith, Sarah herself received strength to conceive, and she bore a child. So what did she do by faith? She received the strength to conceive seed and to bear a child even when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. She pointed out to Abraham and Sarah, nothing is impossible with God. So therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky, and multitude innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. It's the faith of Abraham and the faith of Sarah, and allow them that she, past the age of childbearing, has a son, and they raise him in Isaac, a man who, by the way, is a man who's going to be mentioned, who's a man of faith as well, who's going to be mentioned later on in verse 20. here. And so Abraham's a man of faith. Sarah was a woman of faith. They have Isaac, who's a child who had grew up to have faith in God. And so there's a great example there again in Abraham. And Lord willing, on Sunday, we'll pick up there at verse 13 and continue looking at that example of Abraham and a number of lessons that we can learn from it.
Every tear,